Motocross has always had aftermarket brands. Most sell parts, some have a good run, then the sport moves on. FMF never felt like one of those brands. For a lot of riders, FMF meant something bigger than the pipe bolted to the bike. The logo carried weight. It meant speed. It meant credibility. If a bike had FMF on it, people noticed. That kind of reputation doesn't happen because you buy enough ads or slap your logo on enough bikes. It happens when riders believe you've earned it, and FMF earned it the hard way. Before FMF Racing became one of the most recognizable brands in motocross, it was just Don Emler trying to solve a problem that kept driving him crazy. He was fast enough to race at the pro level, skilled enough to hang with serious riders, but week after week, he kept running into the same frustrating reality. Guys with better bikes kept beating him. Not always better riders, better machines, and that got under Emler's skin. In the late 1960s, motocross in America still felt imported. The fastest bikes came from Europe, Husqvarna, CZ, Mako, and if you had factory backing, you had advantages that privateers simply didn't. More support, better equipment, more development. For most riders, that gap was just part of the sport. Emler didn't accept that. What bothered him wasn't just losing. It was losing to something he believed could be fixed. Unlike raw riding talent, a motorcycle was something that you could change. So while most riders focused on training harder or riding more laps, Emler became obsessed with the machine itself. He started tearing bikes apart and putting them back together differently, chasing tiny gains that most riders wouldn't even notice. That obsession started following him home. Nights in a garage in Hawthorne turned into experiments. Exhaust pipes cut apart and re-welded, cylinders reshaped, new combinations tested, failed ideas scrapped, and then tried again. This wasn't business. It wasn't branding. It was obsession. He wanted to line up on Sunday with something faster than the guy next to him. And eventually, people started noticing. His bikes didn't just run differently, they sounded different. Riders started asking questions. Then they started asking for pipes. What started as one racer trying to solve his own problem slowly turned into something bigger. By 1973, the demand had outgrown the garage. Emler needed a name. He called the shop Flying Machine Factory, FMF.
1973, my dad, Don Emler, started the company in his garage right here in Hawthorne, California. Our roots are still here.
It sounded bigger than what it actually was because at the time, it was still tiny. Just one obsessive tuner in a garage welding pipes by hand. That changed because of one race. In 1973, the AMA still didn't take the 125 class seriously. The small bikes were treated like a stepping stone, something riders passed through on their way to the 250s and 500s that actually mattered. Then, Arroyo Cycle Park in Southern California decided otherwise. The track hosted a 125 race that drew serious attention, including factory support from Honda and its brand new Elsinore 125, a bike built specifically to dominate the class. The contrast couldn't have been bigger. On one side, factory money, engineers, and resources. On the other, Don Emler, bringing his hand-built pipes from a garage in Hawthorne. He showed up anyway, and then something happened nobody expected. Ray Lopez won on an FMF-tuned Penton. A garage tuner had just beaten a factory-backed program. That win changed everything. It embarrassed Honda. It helped force the racing world to take the 125 class seriously. More importantly for Emler, it proved something he'd believed for years. The factories weren't unbeatable. If you understood the machine well enough, you could beat money. Riders started showing up at his door. Bigger names followed. Future stars wanted what he was building. FMF had gone from garage experiment to something real. And this was only the beginning. Within a couple decades, FMF wouldn't just be winning races. Their logo would be everywhere. Most riders bolt on an exhaust pipe without thinking much about what it's actually doing. For nearly 2 decades, that pipe was the entire reason FMF Racing existed. And understanding why means understanding what made Don Emler different. A 2-stroke pipe isn't just there to dump exhaust out the back. It actively helps the engine make power. The moment the exhaust port opens, a pressure wave shoots through the pipe and helps pull fresh fuel mixture into the cylinder. A split second later, that same wave reflects back toward the engine, pushing unburned fuel back inside just before the port closes. It all happens in milliseconds, but if the timing is right, the engine makes noticeably more power. That meant small changes could completely change how a bike felt. A pipe could make a bike hit hard in the mid-range and reward an aggressive rider. Another could pull smoother and stay more controllable when traction got sketchy. To most riders, it was just an exhaust pipe. To Emler, it was a tuning tool. He treated pipe design like a puzzle, and he never believed one answer worked for everybody. That mindset shaped FMF's entire product line. The Fatty became the pipe most riders knew first. It delivered strong, usable power without demanding much setup, which made it the kind of upgrade you could bolt on and feel immediately. The factory Fatty pushed harder in a different direction, lighter and more aggressive. It gave privateers something that felt closer to factory-level performance without factory money. Then there was the FMF Gnarly. That pipe said everything about how FMF thought. Instead of chasing peak horsepower, the Gnarly sacrificed some top-end revs for low-end torque. In motocross, that trade-off might not always make sense. In the woods, it can mean everything. When you're crawling through rocks, roots, and tight single-track, smooth torque matters a lot more than a big dyno number. FMF also understood something much bigger than horsepower. Noise was becoming a real threat to riding areas. That led to one of their most important products, the Turbine Core Spark Arrestor. It wasn't flashy, and it wasn't built around bragging rights. Its job was simple: reduce fire risk, cut noise, and keep exhaust flowing well enough that riders didn't feel like they were choking the bike. It became the best-selling spark arrestor in the world for a reason. This is the part people often miss about FMF. They weren't only chasing horsepower. They were helping keep riding areas open at a time when one noise complaint could shut a trail down for everyone. By the late 1990s, FMF had become something Don Emler probably never imagined back in that garage in Hawthorne. They still made exhaust pipes, but FMF no longer felt like just an exhaust company. It had become part of motocross culture. The timing helped. Motocross was entering one of the biggest boom periods the sport had ever seen. Supercross was growing fast, amateur racing was thriving, and local tracks were packed every weekend with kids on 80s, teenagers on 125s, and grown men trying to wrestle 252 strokes around rough outdoor tracks. Then freestyle motocross exploded and pulled the sport even further into the mainstream. The entire culture was changing. Riders weren't just showing up to race anymore. They were building bikes that reflected who they were. That shift mattered because FMF fit the era almost perfectly. The golden era of FMF was also the golden era of the two-stroke. And on a two-stroke, the pipe mattered in a way young riders raised on modern bikes might not fully understand. It wasn't hidden behind plastic. You saw it immediately. The pipe sat right out in the open, one of the most visible parts on the entire bike, and it was often one of the first upgrades riders made. If you wanted more power, better throttle response, or just wanted your bike to feel less stock, the exhaust was usually near the top of the list. That gave FMF something most aftermarket companies never get. When riders upgraded, people noticed. You saw it everywhere. The fast local kid on a built 125 usually had one. The serious woods rider probably had one too. Even weekend riders who weren't chasing lap times wanted that same connection to performance. That became FMF's real advantage. Very few performance brands earn trust at every level of a sport. Factory teams relied on FMF, privateers could afford them, and weekend riders genuinely wanted them. FMF lived in all three worlds at once, and that gave the brand something most competitors never had. A lot of brands gain credibility at the top and slowly lose connection with average riders. They become associated with factory money and elite racing until the regular guy no longer feels like the brand belongs to him. FMF never completely made that jump. A kid on a used YZ125 could bolt on an FMF pipe and feel connected to the same performance culture as the riders he watched on Saturday night. That kind of connection builds loyalty. Then freestyle motocross pushed the brand even further. When FMX exploded during the X Games era, motocross stopped being only about race results. Style suddenly mattered more. Personality mattered more. Riders with presence became stars in a completely different way, and certain brands benefited from that shift. FMF was one of them. The brand felt aggressive, modern, and unmistakably Moto without feeling fake or overproduced. and that last part especially mattered. Riders can spot fake branding instantly. FMF still felt like riders making products for riders, and that authenticity helped the company grow far beyond the bike itself. By the early 2000s, FMF apparel had become almost as recognizable as the exhausts. That's when it became obvious the company had crossed into something bigger. Exhaust companies are supposed to sell pipes. They aren't supposed to become brands riders wear when they aren't even riding, but FMF did. The hoodies became especially popular. Shirts and decals were everywhere. You saw the logo in pits, garages, shop walls, and parking lots long before social media made brand identity a constant performance. FMF had become something money usually can't manufacture: authentic motocross cool. And once a brand reaches that level, something changes. Riders stop buying only horsepower. They start buying identity. For a while, FMF felt untouchable. The company that started with one guy welding pipes in a garage had become one of the coolest names in motocross. But underneath that momentum, the sport itself was beginning to change, and the company that had built its identity around two-stroke performance was about to face the biggest challenge in its history. For years, if riders argued about exhaust pipes, the debate usually came down to two names: FMF or Pro Circuit. The rivalry helped define an era. Mitch Payton built Pro Circuit around one obsession: maximum race performance. Their products earned a reputation for aggressive power delivery, the kind of hit that rewarded riders willing to keep the engine screaming and ride right at the limit. Don Emler approached performance differently. FMF built race-winning products too, but Emler saw performance through a wider lens. Pro Circuit became synonymous with all-out race performance, while FMF focused on building speed that worked beyond the pro level. Power that could win on Saturday night, but also make a bike faster, smoother, and easier to ride everywhere else. For decades, that rivalry pushed both companies forward. Every shootout, every magazine test, every bench racing argument in a pit or shop forced both brands to keep improving. But while FMF and Pro Circuit were competing against each other, something much bigger was happening underneath them. The sport itself was changing. By the early 2000s, AMA displacement rules started heavily favoring four-strokes. Manufacturers poured money into development. Japanese and European factories pivoted fast. What began as experimentation turned into an industry-wide shift. Almost overnight, the sound of motocross started changing. The sharp crack of 125s and screaming 252 strokes slowly gave way to deeper, heavier, high-compression four-strokes. For a lot of fans, it felt like progress. For FMF, it felt like an existential threat. Because this wasn't just a new bike, it was a completely different engineering problem. The knowledge that had made FMF dominant in the two-stroke era no longer transferred cleanly. The company that had spent decades mastering one of the strangest pieces of motorcycle engineering in the sport suddenly had to solve a different problem from scratch. And then came the bigger threat: noise. Early four-strokes were loud in a way two-strokes had never been. Their low-frequency rumble carried farther across open land, deeper into neighborhoods, and straight into the ears of people who already wanted dirt bikes gone. Tracks started closing. Land managers started cracking down. Noise complaints became ammunition. For the first time in decades, FMF wasn't just fighting competitors, they were fighting irrelevance. The answer came from looking at a part of the exhaust system most riders barely noticed: the header pipe. FMF developed the power bomb, a patented expansion chamber built directly into the head pipe. As superheated exhaust gas left the cylinder, the chamber allowed it to expand, cool, and re-enter the system more efficiently before reaching the muffler. That mattered for two reasons. One, it improved exhaust scavenging, helping recover performance and throttle response. And it also reduced sound before the exhaust ever reached the rear silencer. That single idea helped FMF attack both problems at once: power and noise. FMF kept pushing the concept further with the Mega Bomb and later the Factory 4.1, proving something critical. They weren't a two-stroke company. They were an engineering company. And that distinction may have saved them, because the two-stroke era was ending, whether riders liked it or not. The brands that survived weren't the ones most loyal to the past. They were the ones capable of adapting to the future. The four-stroke transition proved FMF could adapt technically. What came next tested something deeper: whether they could stay FMF. Because while the motorcycle industry was changing, the business side of motocross was changing too. By the 2000s and 2010s, more and more aftermarket brands were getting swallowed by private equity. bought by larger corporations or pushed toward overseas manufacturing to protect margins. On paper, the logic made sense. Lower labor costs, higher margins, faster scaling. But motocross doesn't always reward what makes sense on paper. FMF chose a different path. They stayed independent. That decision starts with Don Emler. Long after most founders would have stepped away, Emler remained hands-on, spending his days in the dyno room and on the shop floor, still chasing better numbers decades after welding his first pipes in a garage. His son, Donnie Emler Jr., known throughout motocross as Little D, grew into the next generation of leadership, helping carry the company forward without changing what made it recognizable in the first place. That consistency mattered because FMF never stopped building like a manufacturer instead of just a brand. The company operates out of a 100,000 square foot facility in Rancho Dominguez, California, where much of the process remains under one roof. Steel comes in raw, titanium tubing gets shaped in-house, pipes get stamped, formed, welded, and assembled on American soil. That kind of commitment looked almost old-fashioned for years. Then the pandemic hit. When COVID disrupted global supply chains, competitors built around overseas manufacturing ran into the same nightmare. Delayed shipments, empty shelves, and back orders that dragged on for months. FMF had an advantage. Their supply chain was shorter, their manufacturing stayed close. While other companies struggled to get product into customers' hands, FMF kept shipping. Suddenly, the old-school model didn't look outdated anymore. It looked resilient. Little D has spoken openly about why FMF has turned down outside buyers over the years. Once investors take over, the pressure changes. Decisions start getting filtered through margins, growth targets, and quarterly reports. Eventually, the spreadsheet starts winning arguments the riders used to win. FMF refused to let that happen. They stayed privately owned. No boardroom, no corporate parent, just a company still operating by one of Don Emler's oldest rules. Pay cash, owe the bank nothing. That mindset did more than protect the business. It protected the identity. Because after 50 years, FMF's biggest advantage still isn't engineering. It's trust. Riders still believe the people building the product actually understand why the product matters. That's a rare thing in modern motorsports. And it may be the biggest reason FMF still feels like FMF. FMF built its reputation in motocross, but the off-road world gave the company something deeper. That's what connected FMF to Kurt Caselli. Caselli, known by the number 66, became one of the most respected off-road racers of his generation. But the people who knew him rarely talked about wins first. They talked about the person, his intensity, his leadership, the way he elevated everyone around him. In November 2013, while leading the Baja 1000, Caselli was killed in a racing accident. That loss shook the entire off-road community. FMF didn't treat it like a tragedy people mention once and move on from. They stayed involved, helping support the Kurt Caselli Foundation and its mission to make the sport safer for future riders. That's another side of FMF most people never see. The company that built its name on horsepower also uses its influence to help riders come home. And that may say more about FMF than any dyno chart ever could. A lot of brands survive long enough to become legends. Far fewer stay relevant. That's one of the hardest things to do in motocross. Sport moves fast. New riders replace old heroes. Trends change. Platforms change. The brands that mattered to one generation can disappear from the conversation entirely by the next. FMF never completely disappeared. Part of that comes from staying close to the riders. After bringing its apparel business back in-house, FMF leaned even harder into direct connection with the people who actually buy the product. Not through polished corporate marketing or trend chasing, but through the same rider-first mentality that built the company in the first place. That mindset still shows up everywhere. It shows up when Little D jumps on podcasts like the Pulp MX show and talks to fans the same way he'd talk to someone at the track. It shows up in the FMF Privateer Power Award at AMA Pro Motocross, where independent riders without factory backing get recognized for performances that might otherwise go unnoticed. And it shows up in something even simpler. FMF still feels accessible. Even after decades at the top, the company doesn't feel like a giant corporation selling performance from a distance. It still feels like people who ride, building products for people who ride. That matters. Because in a sport where authenticity is almost impossible to fake, riders know when a brand loses touch. 50 years after one guy started welding pipes in a Hawthorne garage, FMF is still part of the conversation. And in motocross, that might be the hardest race to win. Has FMF stayed true to what made it great? Or has modern motocross changed too much for any brand to stay authentic? Thanks for watching, and stay wicked.